Shalom lekulam. Welcome everyone to virtually to the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here, and I know that many people here have seen me many times before and are regulars on this Wednesday session, this Wednesday event that we've been doing now for over a year. Those of you that are not should join us every week. We have guests dealing with various issues relating to Israeli politics and Israeli security and Jewish history and Zionism in the Middle East. We always have a very enlightening conversation or lecture from our guests. So if you're not receiving if you're not on my mailing list and receiving the updates, then email me at paulg@begincenter.org.il. For that, I will write that in the chat later. For those of you unfamiliar to how this is going to work, I'm going to speak to our guest for about half an hour, and then I'll invite you all to submit questions into the chat facility at the bottom of your screen for me to put those questions to him. Our guest is Professor Gil Troy, a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, currently living in Jerusalem. He's an award-winning American presidential historian, a leading Zionist activist, the author of many critically acclaimed books, most recently Never Alone, Prison Politics and My People, co-authored with Natan Sharansky, and which actually he spoke about on this Zoom program last Sukkot as part of a teaching session over the Sukkot holiday. His 2019 book, The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, Tomorrow, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist and was actually launched here at the Begin Center at a wonderful event that we had here a couple of years ago. And Moynihan's Moment, America's Fight Against Zionism as Racism, was designated one of 2012's best books by Jewish Ideas Daily. Gil is, as I've intimated, has a long association with the Begin Center. It's always great to have him on. He's a personal friend, a personal mentor, and I remain a firm admirer and inspired by his work. So Gil, thank you very much for joining us. Great to see you as always.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Paul, and to learn with you.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about a much discussed article that you co-wrote with Natan Sharansky in Tablet magazine last week. I think it came out, or 10 days ago, maybe.
Yeah.
About the un-Jews. This was the kind of somewhat provocative, but I think very well explained term that you used. Basically, for today at least, for anti-Zionist Jews, anti-Israel Jews, and it was prompted, I think, by the response of a minority of American Jews to the recent conflict with Hamas, a minority who adopted a very strong anti-Zionist, anti-Israel position. You gave a lot of examples. You mentioned one very striking one for me, at least, was the Jewish law students at City University in New York, who demanded, quote, a free and just Palestine from the river to the sea, end quote. So most of us know that means the end of Israel. So a rejection of Zionism, a rejection of Israel, in the name of Judaism, in the name of their specific definition of Jewish values. So can you, first of all, take us into this, into your thought process, yours and Natan Sharansky's? Why are they un-Jews? What's behind the name that you're giving to these people?
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining and for listening and for perhaps holding off judgment before attacking. Because it seems that people just hear the word un-Jew, and even academics who are supposedly trained in reading texts don't read the article and simply attack it. Let's give two kinds of context. Number one, both Natan Sharansky, my co-author on the book Never Alone, and on a number of articles recently, and I have spent decades of our lives talking about Jewish unity. The book Never Alone is about how when you're a part of the Jewish people, you could be in the gulag all alone, you could be stuck in your apartment because it's COVID, you're never alone. We were talking about opening up a dialogue right to left, like Abraham's tent. But Abraham's tent also had boundaries. And every community, by definition, has boundaries. So with that in mind, and after literally a year and a half of talking about the book to so many different Zoom groups, including you, Paul, and an illuminating conversation, as you mentioned, the Gaza operation happens. And what are we hearing from too many of our American friends? Now, I want to emphasize, so many of my personal friends in the United States and Canada were sending emails of love. So many students I spoke to at McGill University and elsewhere were sending not only emails of love, but also of deep concern and of trauma because they were being attacked for standing up to Israel. But all the energy in the conversation, because that's what the media likes, because that's what Twitter likes, and I spell Twitter dumb, D-U-M-B, was about the 100 rabbinical students who denounced Israel in such a harsh way that one of their deans said, "Where's your empathy?" The conversation was about rabbis from the East Coast and from the West Coast who threw out words like apartheid and threw out phrases like ethnic cleansing without any sensitivity to what we were experiencing here in Jerusalem. But they're not the un-Jews. I can disagree with them. I can find them frustrating. I can say you're too obsessed with the occupation. I could say you're overly critical, but they stayed within the Jewish tent. Even if I disliked their language, even if I disliked their tone, even if I thought, they're a little lacking in empathy and I'd never hire you as my rabbi. But at the same time, as you mentioned, Paul, there were petitions coming from dozens of Jewish studies professors and Israel studies professors in which they signed on their name and their institutions and their departments, often donated by good Jewish people, saying that Israel is a Jewish supremacy state. Jewish supremacy, they should have used the original German because it comes from the Nazis. They use phrases like ethno-nationalism. They use phrases like settler colonialism. All these phrases are delegitimizing phrases. All these phrases are attempts to undo the two pillars of modern Jewish identity today, two of the three pillars of modern Jewish identity today. We have God, we have the tradition, we have peoplehood, and we have statehood. And they're doing it in the name of a kind of higher Jewishness. They're doing it in the name of kind of a purified Jewishness that isn't primitive like the Jewishness of those Israelis. So for all our love of dialogue, Natan Sharansky and I felt that we had to help, in particular, our friends on the left, our students, to distinguish between healthy criticism, criticism of what Israel does, and unhealthy criticism of what Israel is that is weaponized on social media and is encouraging this kind of hooliganish anti-Semitism we're seeing, and frankly was encouraging the Hamas rockets. Their words had implications. Their words stirred up violence. Now, they're not non-Jews because they're deeply Jewish, these Jewish professors, these rabbis, a very small minority, right? They're not ex-Jews because they're still part of the Jewish conversation. They're not as a Jews, which is what you'd call someone who's really from outside the tent. This is from this is a British import in honor of you, Paul, which is someone who has no connection to the Jewish community, but only because he was born Jewish or she was born Jewish and wants to embarrass the Jewish people says, well, as a Jew, I'm embarrassed. No, these are un-Jews because from deep within the heart of the Jewish community, they are undoing core values of peoplehood and statehood. And so we wrote this article called Un-Jews. We explained it. And then, especially when Natan said, hey, wait a minute, I recognize that phenomenon. I know what happened in the early days of the Soviet Revolution when yeshiva bachers, good yeshiva students, joined the Communist Party and helped turn the Communist Party against the Jewish people and undid the entire infrastructure of Russian Jewry and of Eastern European Jewry. And then we started going back in history. And I said, I recognize that pattern from the disputations in the mid-ages, when there were these people who were still so deep in the Jewish conversation, even though they had converted, that they were the ones coaching the church against people like Nachmanides and trying to prove, because they still were in the Jewish conversation, still trying to show that Judaism was wrong and that Christianity was the way to extend the Jewish value of universalism and of universal peace. And then we went all the way back to the Roman era, and some people said we should have even gone back to the Hellenizers. And so we wrote this very simple article in Tablet, being very, very limited in our field of vision, saying only these people within the Jewish community who are really using words that are violent in their implications, delegitimizing in their language, and delighting the Palestinian extremists, they are, what do you call them? Un-Jews. It didn't make me the most popular person in many faculty lounges, so let's just say that.
Yeah, no, there's been some, I mean, as I said to you before we started, like it struck me that the one or two things that I've seen written against the article seemed to me, at least, to be by people that hadn't read the article, because they didn't seem to be responding to the points you made. They were, I mean, for example, they were accusing that the un-Jews that they accuse you and Natan or the people under this un-Jew rubric, they said were all critics of Israel. I mean, it was this kind of, that you were, attacking anyone that has any criticism of the Israeli government, which is kind of, first, it's not what you said, but also, I mean, you're one of many people writing within Israel that at times has criticized the Israeli government yourself. I mean, it's not a serious critique. I think what I thought was brilliant in the piece was the way that you connected, as you said, the anti-Zionist Jews of today with those historical forerunners, if you like, of the Communist Party, and then those that converted to Christianity in the Middle Ages. And what you said was that all of them, all of them were pursuing what they claimed is a kind of universal good, a universalist impulse, which is also within Judaism, right? Can you speak to that somewhat?
Yes, that was one of the dimensions of the un-Jews, was that that they claim to be saving Judaism in the name of Judaism, and they're actually destroying a core value of Judaism. And if you think about it, these Jewish studies professors, these City University of New York, we call them CUNY law students, are saying, we're the ones who are for social justice. We're the ones for peace. We're the ones for tikkun olam. So they're claiming, in the name of a Jewish value, the right to negate the state of Israel, the right to negate Jewish peoplehood, the right to negate solidarity. And again, Natan recognized that, because then many of these Jewish communists, many of these Soviet Jews were saying, hey, wait a minute, we're doing this because this is the universal good. This is the universal ideal of Judaism. And so we're destroying Judaism and ultimately destroying Jews and ultimately destroying themselves and their own grandkids' identities in the name of Judaism. And that was also being done in the Middle Ages. The disputations of the church were saying what was the claim of the church? That we're now the authentic Judaism, because we understand the universal message of Isaiah. We understand the universal push for peace. We understand universal justice. And then, being mischievous and admittedly stretching a little bit, we talked about supporters of the Roman Empire who said, we're turning on these small, provincial, primitive Jews, because we were kind of caricaturing the way our enemies, and they are our enemies, caricature the state of Israel, to join the enlightened Roman Empire, again in the name of Judaism. And so in the same way that in Vietnam, certain American generals were guilty of destroying a village in order to save it, we say that these, and again, it's a very small, extreme, but extremely self-righteous group, are destroying Judaism, a core value of Judaism, core pillars of Judaism, undoing them, because they're actually not succeeding in destroying them, but they're trying to, they're attacking them in the name of a higher Jewish value, and we're not buying it. And, they accuse us of being divisive. They accuse us of being insulting. And I say, what's more insulting than calling the state of Israel a center of Jewish supremacy? Again, a Nazi phrase, or apartheid state. There's so many words you could use to criticize Israel. But when you choose these words from the Palestinian extremist vocabulary, especially if you're a Jewish studies professor, an Israel studies professor, you know what you're doing. You're swimming in a sea that's poisoned with Jewish hate, and that unfortunately is tinged with too much Jewish blood. And now it's also blood in America and in England and in France and elsewhere too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it does seem to me to. I mean, this is something that I actually spoke about on an earlier one of these sessions, but even those anti-Zionists that are absolutely adamant that they'll have no truck with anti-Semitism inevitably find themselves, standing on platforms or in chat rooms with people that are quoting Protocols of the Elders of Zion or talking about the Rothschilds, or it's inevitable. It's just, this is part of the, as you say, this is the toxic sea that they're swimming in. So as someone who has written a lot and thought a lot about Jewish identity, contemporary Jewish identity, what would you say to someone who said, okay, I'm a Jew, I want to square my Jewish identity with a desire for helping humanity at large, the universalist impulse. And these guys, the people you're calling the un-Jews, are saying that this is how you do it. And you're saying that, obviously you don't agree. So what would you say to that person that wants to keep the particularism of Judaism but doesn't want to reject universalism? What would you say to them?
I'd say, welcome to the club. So first of all, I'd say the un-Jews, the extremist anti-Zionists are doing is actually they're throwing their people under the bus in the name of universalism. That's not true universalism, right? The true universalism would be to be proud of who you are. Look at what Nelson Mandela says in his autobiography, which I had the privilege of reading. He says, until I knew who I was, until I doubled down on my identity, I couldn't fight for my freedom. These universalists, my mother warned, are so open-minded their brains fall out. But more than that, let's be honest. People love to talk about how Israel is a genocidal state trying to destroy the Palestinians. And of course, we see how the Palestinian population has only grown and grown. Who's calling for genocide in this conversation? The Iranians and certain Palestinians. And when you use phrases like from the river to the sea, Jewish supremacy, etc., you're actually endorsing an agenda that would lead to death. How is that universalist? And how is that pro-peace? I'm writing right now an introduction to a collection of Herzl's writings that's coming out. Herzl himself, Theodor Herzl, talks about how by being a particularist, by being proud of being Jewish, by restoring a sense of Jewish dignity, by standing up to anti-Semitism and to self-hating Jews, that's how we can do tikkun olam. That's how we can create a model society. That's what Natan Sharansky has been teaching from the moment he discovered his Jewish identity in the 6-Day War, when the anti-Semitic jokes changed from talking about what a sniveling coward he was to what a bully he was. And he discovered his identity, and boom, like Nelson Mandela, whom he didn't know at the time, he discovered his fight for freedom. That dance between universalism and particularism is in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. That dance between universalism and particularism is in every one of our Jewish holidays. That dance between universalism and particularism is the Torah, if you will, of Menachem Begin and David Ben-Gurion, of our new president, Isaac Herzog, and our outgoing president, Ruby Rivlin, one from the right and one from the left. So no one from these Jewish studies professors is going to teach Natan Sharansky much about universalism. He paid the price. Part of the reason why the Soviets came after him was because he was part of the Refusnik movement, the small number of Refusniks who also worked with Andrei Sakharov, also worked for human rights. So he's paid a 9-year price for standing up for human rights, for fighting for human rights. He's spent his entire career, once he was in Israel, fighting for human rights, fighting for dissidents in all forms of democracy, and also being a proud Jew. That's the Jewish way. That's Sinai and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the liberation from Egypt. That's our way. That's our dance. That's what you do so much in the Begin Center every day, Paul.
Yeah, so before I ask another question, I want to encourage everyone to write their questions in. There's a lot going on in the chat, but right now it seems mostly to be Very, very smart and wise observations, but not really things that I can put to Gil Troy for him to answer. So I'm happy to see the conversation going on, and please, by all means, continue. But I also want some questions to put to our guest. Gil, I want to quote a section of the article because I really love this, and it speaks to what you just said. It says Judaism's dualities, its seeming paradoxes, balancing universalism and particularism, freedom and identity, or in today's terms, liberalism and nationalism, have often functioned as ideological brakes, preventing purists from going too far with any one idea, no matter how noble sounding. The totalitarian mind cannot stand the tension and can kill people who seem to stand in the way of the dictator's march towards love or equality or justice. The democratic mind and the traditional Jewish mind delights in working out the dilemmas without fully embracing or rejecting either pole. I think that's brilliant. And I like it not only because it speaks so cogently to the wider point you're making in the article, but also because I think it identifies a problem, not just in this context, but in the wider world today. I mean, so much of the conversation about politics today is about the rush towards the extremes in the United States, in Europe, even in Israel, in different ways. Do you agree? Do you think there's something in this argument which can be expanded beyond the Jewish conversation?
Yes, when you write with somebody, and I could really go through line by line and show how Natan Sharansky's contribution and my contribution each made the argument better and stronger, and how it really was to use a Star Trek term, a Vulcan mind meld, where it really was an extraordinary collaboration. And I have to say, of course, what a privilege and an honor it is. One of the people in this duo is a Jewish hero, and one of them is just a kid from Queens, and it's really such a pleasure and a privilege to work with him. But I actually wanted to add another paragraph, and he vetoed it. It was exactly that, Paul, because we did have that paragraph that we stand by, which is, we're being countercultural here by calling out the un-Jews, but also giving the countercultural vision of Judaism, of Zionism, which is identity and freedom, universalism and particularism, liberalism and nationalism. We're pushing back against the totalitarianism of the right and the totalitarianism of the left. We're pushing back against this nihilistic notion that I have to choose one extreme or the other, which is truly a totalitarian ideal. And we're embracing the crossed wires.
Yeah.
And I wanted to add one more paragraph saying that, in a sense, what's going on in the United States with Trump and also with the woke push is an undoing project itself, right? The Trump project is undoing liberalism from nationalism, right? And it's disentangling. We use the phrase that these un-Jews are trying to disentangle nationalism and Jewish peoplehood and Jewish statehood from modern Jewish identity. So Donald Trump is trying to disentangle liberalism from nationalism. And what are so many of the woke people doing? Trying to disentangle particularism, nationalism, group pride, if you don't happen to be one of the small groups of people who define themselves as oppressed, from their universal ideal. And Natan said, no mission creep. Natan said, we're writing an article about Jews, for Jews within the Jewish world. You can write one of those articles when you write your op-eds in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Jerusalem Post. And that's the beauty of our relationship. I think he was right for that article, but I think there's a broader conversation here. I definitely think that when I understand wokeism and I understand Trumpism, they're both undoing projects. And we're trying to call out the undoers of the world. We're trying to call out the un-Americans of the world, the un-Jews of the world. And in fact, Natan, you may have noticed, is not a native English speaker. And so for me, un-Jew kind of rang a bell in a very profound way. And I knew it would get under people's skin, a very small group of people who aren't open to thought and criticism. And they're so busy criticizing Israel all the time. They say, we have to have more criticism in the conversation. But as soon as you criticize them, they go ballistic. And one of the ways I explained to him un-Jews, I said there's a notion of un-American. Right? And un-American can mean two things. It means it's not being it, but it's also the un-thing is it's an active, right? It's a negation. And that's what I wanted to get to. It's the negation that's so problematic and that's so hurtful, especially when so many of us, I know people on this call were in shelters, especially when so many of us, I know people on this call had children in the Air Force and on the Gaza border. And it's not a game. It's not just some kind of intellectual exercise in a faculty lounge. This is real life with real implications. Your words can kill. Some words can liberate, can inspire, can elevate, can unite, and some words can kill.
That's fascinating, and I think the American the un-American thing also works with what you said about the right and the sort of extremes of right and left in the States. That, you know, on the sort of, you know, sort of alt-right in America, they're sort of the un-American thing is the anti-liberal. The anti-liberal, you know, liberalism is at the heart of the American idea, and to remove that is un-American. And on the left is kind of, you know, the whole, I don't know, 1619 project and all this, you know, removing the sort of the patriotism or the idea of you know, a real appreciation of and love of America from the conversation. So quite shockingly, people actually listened to me and wrote a lot of questions in. I'm a father of 3 young children, so I'm not used to people actually doing what I asked them to do. There's a bunch of questions here. I'm going to get to them for you. So a very simple question, or at least the question is simple. Whether the answer is, I don't know, is how many un-Jews are there in your estimation? I don't know. That's from David. I don't know whether he means just in the United States.
It's an excellent question. They punch way above their weight. All I know is that the latest Pew study came out and showed that over 80% of American Jews are proud of their connection to Israel and proud of Israel. And the polls have consistently showed that the core of American Jewry, like, by the way, the core of America, despite all the media coverage, remains pro-Israel. And one of the problems is that the media itself and Twitterdom emphasizes these un-Jews and gives them an outsized voice. So, for example, classic un-Jews are if not now, right? They grew up in Ramah. They grew up in Salman Schechter. They grew up in the heart of the American Jewish community. They speak Jewish so fluently. And then this small group of kids comes to college campuses and flips. And 13 of them come on birthright 3 years ago, planning to walk out and pick the right moment to walk out and walk out. 47,000 people were on birthright that summer. They didn't get a front page article in the New York Times. The New York Times had never written an article about the phenomenon of 750,000 now young adults going on this Birthright Israel program, a program that's been copied by the Koreans and by the Irish and by so many people who want to see, how do you do identity in the modern world? But these 13 got the play. So number one, we see that the media emphasizes the extremes. I wish it was that simple. And I wouldn't be that worried if it was just a media game. But when I looked and I saw Jewish studies professors, young rabbis, Israel studies professors, and when I see the conversation that's going on, especially in the elite campuses in the United States of America, and I see how many double thinkers there are and how many people have been bullied into silence as a result, they don't have the numbers. They don't have the masses, but they have the New York Times, they have the media, they have Twitterdom, and they have outsized, not just, they don't just punch above their weight because they get more attention, but they also have more influence. And the challenge, I was speaking to somebody at breakfast this morning, put it very well. Is this a shift or a trend? If it's a trend, we'll outlive it, we'll survive it. But if it's a shift, and if these opinion leaders, the rabbis of the next generation, not all of them, I've spoken to some rabbinic students who are furious that these are the ones who get the attention. I've spoken to some Jewish studies professors, by the way, off this article, who are telling me that those people have been canceling them. There are Jewish studies professors who are proud Jewish patriots, but unfortunately, many of the people who signed this article are among the dominant voices in Jewish studies, and they have no patience not only for a loudmouth like Troy and that troublemaker Sharansky, but also for anyone within the Jewish studies world who dares to disagree. Where's their openness? Where's their pride? I said to my kids the other day, because somebody at shul was asking me, okay, we have a pop-up minyan, it's not a shul, was saying, did you anticipate this backlash and you were upset by it? And one of my kids overheard, and I said, I don't want to sound grandiose, and I wish myself long life, but if I drop dead tomorrow and people say, you know what, that Troy, sometimes he was a little bit vehement in his love of the Jewish people, I'll be okay. But I wouldn't be okay if I was one of those academics who dropped dead tomorrow and people said, you know what, When he had the chance, he threw the Jewish people under the bus. When he or she had the chance, he betrayed the Jewish people. When he or she had the chance, it was more important to be popular in the faculty lounge than to stand for Israel and stand for the Jewish people. I'm okay with where I am.
Great. Yes.
Just go back to what you said, Paul. I'm sorry, earlier. I wish there was a critique that I'd read that I went, uh-oh, we went too far, or uh-oh, we didn't say this right. Not one of the critiques that I've read has been thoughtful enough to get me to pause and say, oh, you know what, even this person is worthy of debate. And I regret that because I love debate. That's how I learn. I learn from critics, not just from compliments.
Okay. So there's a couple of similar questions. So Jacqueline just asks where you think the un-Jews come from. And related to that and expanding on it a little is Svi, who says, it's one thing to hear anti-Israel rhetoric from young Jews who are far removed from Judaism and ignorant of Jewish history. It's quite another to hear it from law students who should know better. How do you explain this?
Well, George Orwell has a brilliant essay about the foolishness of intellectuals. And as someone who loves the university, I call myself a case of arrested development. I've also spent enough time around professors and around intellectuals to know that you can't really just trust their political judgment, especially at an age like this. And I wish I could say that it just comes from a place of integrity. It hurts me to say what I'm going to say, but for too many of them, not all of them, for too many of them, and I have to add a number of Israeli professors, it really comes from the deepest, weakest, most galuti, diasporist, exilic part of their personality. I walk into the faculty lounge and I'm an Israeli, or I'm a Jewish studies professor, and everybody else is so busy being woke. I want to be woke too. And so I take the language of woke and I apply it incorrectly to the Israel situation. I take the language of racial reckoning and the analysis of what America is going through vis-a-vis African Americans and whites and misapply it to the Palestinian conflict, even though we know that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a national conflict, not a racial conflict. And we know that Israel has very different kinds of relationships with Arabs in the United Emirates, with its own Israeli Arab citizens, with Palestinian citizens in area A, B, C, let alone Gaza. So if there are political differences, it shows this isn't about Jewish supremacy, God forbid, or anything like that. So where's it coming from? It comes initially right now from a lot of peer pressure, I'm sorry to say, and also from this desire to kind of join the conversation racially. But part of the reason why we went historic, and one of the things that Natan brought to the conversation, was it goes, I'm sorry, to misquote the national anthem, it goes deep within the Jewish soul. There's something within the Jewish soul which always wants to be accepted. There's something within the Jewish soul which always strains for this universalism. And there's something within the Jewish soul which doesn't like this dance that Natan Sharansky loves, that Nelson Mandela loved, that I love, that so many people I revere love, which is, we don't have the perfect formula. And when they go totalitarian, that's when they become un-Jews. When they go totalitarian, in order to truly be a totalitarian, you have to override your brain and you have to avoid the cognitive dissonance that us messy people live with all the time. Yeah. Do I have a perfect balance between Jewish and democratic? Maybe not, but I'm striving, I'm trying, I'm juggling.
Yeah. Just before I get to another question, someone asked if this session is being recorded. It is. It will be on our YouTube channel. You can go to our YouTube channel and just look for it there. You can also email me and I will send you the link. Again, my email address is paulg@begincenter.org.il. I've written it into the chat. So you should make a note of that and email me to get the recording. And also if you want to be on the mailing list, if you are not. Okay, here's a question.
Allow me also to apologize. I'm in I-24 News because we're doing something about the new presidents, and I borrowed an office, and so I don't have perfect lighting. So I apologize if it's driving people crazy.
Right. Yeah. I thought one of people were wondering sort of just how sort of why you have sort of industrial lighting in your home.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Usually when I've spoken to Gil on Zoom, and he's in his home and he has his books behind him, he looks very professorial.
I apologize for that.
Okay, so there was a question here, and I mean, firstly, you may or may not accept the premise of the question, but the question is, why do American Jews breed so many un-Jews when Jews in so many other countries this is from Jessica. She lists South Africa, France, Mexico as examples, have proud Jews standing up for Israel.
I actually think it's a very fair question, and it's going to get me into more trouble. I think there are three things going on. And by the way, I'll validate the question by saying, just last night, I got an email from a professor, a Jewish studies professor, who actually told me that he's shunned because 3 years ago he came out with an article against Jewish Voices for Peace. And he wrote an article in the Jewish Journal of LA, which I encourage everybody to read. Gerald Tanney is his name. And he called out the anti-Zionists in a very systematic way. And I said to myself, oh, I hope the guy has tenure. But the second thing I said is he a real American? It turns out he's Canadian. I had another interaction where I was speaking to somebody who emerged as truly, truly patriotic as an American Jew, and it turned out that they were South African. Now, I know many, many patriotic American Jews. I'm not denigrating American Jews. But there is something in the mentality of the Canadian Jew, the South African Jew, the French Jew today, which is different than the woke, left-wing, progressive American Jew. Three things. Number one, generational, right? More of the Canadian Jews come from the Shoah generation, the survivor generation. More of the South African Jews had their own sense of displacement. Australian Jews, the Shoah generation. The more, and this is a phenomenon of ethnics in general, the more you become a part of the culture, generation by generation, the more you distance yourself. And in America, most American Jews aren't immigrants to red, white, and blue America or to red America. They're immigrants to blue America. And so they buy into the woke culture in an intense way. That's number one. Number two, American Jews, like most Jews, know how to handle right-wing anti-Semitism. We're really good at that. We can identify it. We can smell it a mile away. But left-wing anti-Semitism, progressive anti-Zionism, progressive contempt throws us off. Why? Because we've built a culture that worships the university. We've built a culture that worships the New York Times. We built a culture that worships the media.
Right.
And when they turn on us and they speak our language of Isaiah, our language of Tikkun Olam, our language of peace, our language of universalism, we're lost. And then the third piece is a tool that Natan and I developed in Never Alone, where we talk about that Israeli Jews tend to be Davidian and American Jews tend to be Isaiah. And the Davidian Jews, of course, at the end of the day, have to fight off Goliath, have to fight off the wolves that come after the lambs, have to fight for sovereignty. The Isaiah Jews, because they're a minority in a majority culture, want to make sure that liberalism survives. And they have to fight off forces that are illiberal. And so they read only the parts of Isaiah that emphasize peace and universalism and justice and skip all the national parts and the violent parts. The Davidian Jews have a tendency sometimes to get so defensive that they forget that David also was a psalmist and played the harp. So one of the things we call for in Never Alone is for a healthy dialogue, where the Isaiah Jews remind the Davidian Jews about that other side, liberalism, universalism, peace, justice. And the Davidian Jews remind the Isaiah Jews about that other side, patriotism, peoplehood, nationalism, solidarity, community. That's a healthy dialogue, where we don't finger point, but we learn from one another. And that's what we really like to emphasize, Natan and I. But when you go too far and you cross so many red lines, then we have to call you out. And again, it's not all of American Jewry. American Jewry remains incredibly generous, incredibly supportive, incredibly pro-Israel by the numbers. But the small, very articulate, very influential, and very popular in media circles minority is unfortunately creating something called the silenced majority. And I also have to call out too many of my friends who've said, whispered to me or emailed, I like your article, but won't stand up. Too many people are double thinkers. Too many people are bullied. Too many people are afraid. And the more people who are afraid, the more the fear mongers win, because we don't get people standing up.
Yeah. So there's a question here from Svi, who says, do you have any advice for professors on the tenure track who may feel intimidated in speaking out against the un-Jews positions?
You know, it's a very difficult and sad situation. The whole idea of the university, the whole idea of tenure, is to encourage people to take a range of positions. I went into the university hoping that somebody would come up to me and say, you know, Troy, I disagree with what you said or something that you wrote. Let's have coffee instead of let's cancel you. And unfortunately, and again, I've had these interactions with these two Jewish studies, but I couldn't believe what I discovered just 6 weeks ago. I didn't realize that the rot had entered Jewish studies too. I didn't realize the rot had entered so deep into Israel studies too. And so to hear that there are Jewish studies professors and Israel studies professors who are being intimidated by the far left, all I can tell them is that they're not wrong to be wary, because these people do have their knives out. They do have their long memories. And again, these are the people saying, hey, how come there's no room in a conversation with Israel for there to be any criticism? And I say, how come there's no room in a conversation with you for any self-criticism or for any criticism from me?
Yeah. There was a question here about the United States more broadly. And it's actually last week I had Abe Foxman on this program, and a similar question to him was put about the American left, about American liberals, and he was reasonably optimistic, I would say. His message, I think, was that it's not something that we Jews or Israel should get too exercised about. And I wonder how you feel about that, because I see, you know, on the one hand, we're often told, and I think it's true, that for all that there is this growing anti-Israel faction within the Democratic Party and within the American left, Biden himself is a longtime friend of Israel. His team is full of people with good pro-Israel credentials like Tony Blinken and others. And he won the nomination, not Bernie Sanders. So, you know, these are all good signs. But on the other hand, should we be concerned about the younger generation, about the fact that maybe these people are all that are still warm towards Israel and not antagonistic towards the idea of Jewish national identity and peoplehood? These people are all older liberals. Is that, how do you see the state of play?
Well, to be Jewish is to worry, so we certainly can worry. But more than that, we have to be proactive. I think, and this goes back to the question of whether it's a trend or a shift. I think there are very healthy signs in the Democratic Party, as you mentioned. You know, Twitter dump told us that we were going to have a president named Warren or Sanders or somebody from the far left, and the African Americans of South Carolina in the primary said, we want a president named Biden. We want a president, you can love him or hate him, but the message was, we want somebody who's more a man of the middle, more a man who's moderate, more somebody worried about middle-class issues, middle-class values, and what we call bread and butter issues, rather than this culture war. But there is a culture war going on in America today. I woke up this morning and I read Bret Stephens' column about China. And he said, you know, look, at the end of the day, everybody thinks China's winning, but who was able to create a vaccine that works? Not China, but the United States of America and some of the European countries, and Israel's hoping to come out with a vaccine soon that works. How did whether it came from a lab or from animals is secondary to the fact that the secrecy in China and the heavy-handedness of China led to this world pandemic. And I went, you know, in the 1970s, we used to read articles like this from the far right, the Reagan right, saying, you know what, the Soviet Union isn't going to win. America, and so I actually have more. So I started thinking, maybe we're in the 1970s again. That's, you know, historians think in analogies. In the 1970s, it looked like America was on the way down. In the 1970s, it looked like this far left was coming and dominating and distorting and undermining. And there's actually a wonderful book about the 1970s called America's Nervous Breakdown. And it does seem sometimes that America right now is undergoing a nervous breakdown. I know we have some Canadians on the call. I know when Donald Trump was president, whether you love him or hate him, Canadians joked that it was like living on the second floor of a meth lab and wondering when it was going to blow up. There certainly has been a volatility in America and American culture in the last couple of years, and it's scary. It's scary to those of us in Israel because we need a strong, stable America. It's scary to the Canadians because we need a strong, stable America. And it's scary to Americans. I'm enough of a historian that I won't predict. Because I always say it's hard enough to predict the past, I can't begin to predict the future. But I am also enough of a historian that I can see the fundamentals of America, the decency in America, the sense of patriotism in America, the constructive progress we've made in America on every hot issue, from gays and lesbians to healthcare to African Americans, right? The 2021 is not 1921, is not 1821. And I always defy people, both when we talk about Israel and America, I say, pick a decade you'd rather live in. So I still see the indicators in a positive way, but if we're lazy, if we're complacent, if we don't fight, if we don't call out the un-Jews, if we don't call out the undoing projects from the far left and the far right, we will lose. We can lose. Societies have lost. This is the battle of our lifetimes. It's a battle in America, it's a battle throughout the West, and it's a battle in for the Jewish soul and for Israel as well.
Okay, thank you. So here's an interesting historical question. Maybe it's just interesting for me because I'm British, but I apologize if no one else finds it interesting. Steve asks, at the time of publishing the Balfour Declaration, of the 10 members of the British cabinet, 9 were Christians that voted in favor of the Balfour Declaration, and the one Jew in the cabinet, Edward Montague, voted against. Do the un-Jews consider Montague as part, or maybe I should ask you, do you, Gil, consider him as an un-Jew, as part of this trend towards Zionism, Judaism, and Israel?
It's an interesting question, because look, part of the reason why it's so easy to call out the Jewish studies professors and the CUNY law students of today is because there's a settled consensus, right? One of the things we were saying is, what are the un-Jews doing? They're zeroing in on a core Jewish value of today, which wasn't necessarily true in the 1880s when Zionism was a very marginal movement, or in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was passed. So the un-Jew was really zeroing in on a core Jewish value and undoing it, trying to disentangle it. Montague was more in a moment of flux, a moment of change, but ultimately, yes, he was an un-Jew in that it was more important for him not to rock the boat. It was more important for him to fit in. It was more important for him to throw his people under the bus. And it was very interesting indeed that there were enough British proto-Zionists and philo-Zionists and philo-Semites, from Winston Churchill to Lord Balfour, to say, no, the Jewish people need self-determination, and they need it in their homeland in Palestine, the land of Israel.
Right. There's a point here. H. Fragment Abramson says, in many ways, social media has replaced the historic church for inserting an anti-Jewish slant into almost everything we hear, and the mainstream media is compliant. How do we respond without alienating ourselves?
So I've spent a lot of time in the last 6 weeks talking to students and talking to birthright birthright leaders on how to speak to students. And one of the things I always like to say is, I say, lean in, but don't keel over. We have to listen to the complex conversation about race that's going on in America. We have to acknowledge that when people say white privilege, of course, not every Jew is white. Even if we were white, it wouldn't mean we're bad. Not every white has privilege, and. But at the same time, when I walk down the street, especially when I'm in my jacket and tie, because I was on television today, of street of New York, and an African-American walks down the street, we do get different reactions from different people. So there are privileges that sometimes come from this, and there are some benefits that come from this conversation. But when it's weaponized against us, we say no go. Similarly, social media is wonderful. How many of us have used social media to connect with people during COVID and all that? But when social media is used in such a negative way against Jews, and by the way, I had an illuminating conversation, and I'll be obnoxious and quote my column from the Jerusalem Post today, with birthright participants, and just with hearing them, I understood what's going on, which is that non-combatant non-Jews get some tweet bashing Israel. So they forward it because it comes from some social media influencer. They don't really care. They're not that strong in the issue. But then the social media algorithm reads, oh, anti-Israel, and all of a sudden they get flooded with anti-Israel stuff, and they start forwarding more and more. Their friends in their Jewish friends in the sorority who also aren't that involved in Israel and will end up going on birthright because they're just not there, get offended. Once they get offended, then the initial non-Jewish, non-combatant says, oh, wait a minute, I'm virtue signaling, I'm on the side of racial reckoning, I'm on the side of racial justice and social justice, and it escalates. So before you know it, two kids who were friends, who weren't all that involved in the fight, have now gotten involved in the fight. And that happens all too often. So what do we do? And by the reason, why did we write this on Jews article? We wrote it for students. We wrote it to give them a tool to distinguish between a healthy criticism, a constructive criticism, a criticism of the prime minister, a criticism of the occupation, a criticism of policy, and an unhealthy criticism that crosses the line. We were trying to build a firewall around the extremists, not include everybody who ever muttered anything negative about Israel. We were trying to say to students, you have to be able to distinguish between your professors who are going to use words that are delegitimizing and undermining and violent and vile, and words that are constructive, that are helpful. An academic's job is to come up with phrases that are illuminating, not denigrating, that are thoughtful and thought-provoking, not cliche-ridden and joining the mob. These people failed. A small number failed, and we have to help their students not get sucked into it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest problems generally is academics and intellectuals basically sort of abandoning their academic calling in the name of basically becoming propagandists for a particular cause. There's a question here from Carol who asks simply what to do about them, specifically these people themselves. Do you ignore them? Do you confront them? What's the
The truth is, I mostly ignore them. I have spent much of my career also with, on the Israel issue. I don't spend a lot of time in debates with people with whom I don't share basic values and basic assumptions. I didn't go to PhD school to bang my head against the wall. But what do? I do a bank shot. I'm calling out the un-Jews to speak to the middling Jews, the silenced majority, the double thinkers. We're trying to create, Natan and I, a firewall around the small group of extremists who have outsized power to empower our left-wing friends, our center-left friends, our critical of Israel but loving Israel friends, to have a space where they can say, look, I'm not with you, but I still have my issues with Israel, but I'm still a patriot. We're trying to involve people in a conversation which is multidimensional, which is open-minded, which is thought-provoking. And again, the response that we've gotten, the insane, shrill attacks on the article we didn't write, rather than the article we did write,
yes,
shows that this small group of people are not ready and open for that. And so why waste my breath on them? But notice, by the way, we don't use names. We don't call out names because we don't want the name calling in the Jewish community. We don't want this ugliness. We don't want to make it personal. We're just trying to say there's an ideological war here, and it has implications. And I want to give every single one of the kind people on this call a tool to distinguish. I want to give every one of your kids and your grandkids and your nieces and your nephews, who sometimes are paying $70,000 a year to be propagandized, a way of sifting between healthy, thoughtful, academic conversation and criticism, and, as you were saying, Paul, unhealthy, cliche-ridden propagandism. I mean, if you look at this, that we have a link in our article to this petition that the Jewish studies professors signed. How many cliches are you going to absorb in one paragraph? How many oversimplifications, let alone the fact that it's delegitimizing, let alone the fact that it's encouraging violence, let alone the fact that it's historically wrong, let alone the fact that Jewish supremacy comes from the Nazis? How often are you going to do this if you're an academic with any kind of integrity? I try to avoid the cliches. I don't try to pile them on. And if you signed it, you bought into it in a very profound way at a moment when the Jewish people were suffering, at a moment when a 6-year-old kid in Sderot was killed because his bomb shelter, the window hadn't been closed hard enough in his bomb shelter. That's real. That kid is dead. That family is mourning. My heart is broken. I care about those people. And God forbid that I would ever do anything as an academic sitting in the comfort of my tenured position to help the haters and the killers who killed that boy. I take it very personally.
This kind of goes a little against your comment just now of not not calling out names, but there is a specific question here from Ian about Peter Beinart and what you think about his position on Zionism and his influence, such as it is.
So, first of all, Peter's a delightful person. He's very charming. I worked with him when he was the editor of Open Zion, and I was the editor at large. And everybody said, "What are you working with him?" And I said, "If I can give a pro-Israel position in this website, I'm going to do it." And he never shut me down. But I saw how many people, and it goes to what you were saying, Paul, earlier, how many of the people who were liking him and were supporting him came from the vile anti-Semitic left.
Yeah.
And that was Peter when he was still saying, "I'm a Zionist."
Yeah.
Peter wrote his, and someone made a joke that it should be called now the Un-Jewish Currents article. He's now the editor of the Jewish Currents. This Un-Jewish article saying, we don't need statehood. And when he buys into these idiotic notions that there's some Arab country where you can live from the river to the sea with free rights and peace and prosperity and kumbaya, and doesn't take responsibility for what would really be genocidal implications for the thing he's called for, he crosses a line. So whereas he was in my Zionist Ideas book before, talking about the tension between liberalism and Zionism, he's left the tent. And so he's still a nice person. He still has good values in his family, but he is someone who truly has not only bought in, but really encouraged a generation of un-Jews in the name of social justice. He's actually the classic, the poster child of the un-Jew. And there's a very thorough, thoughtful, not personal analysis of his positions in Fathom this week that goes into it and that shows just how far he's gone in going into the heart of the Jewish project, and with a series of distortions for which he doesn't take responsibility and doesn't acknowledge the context in which Palestinian nationalism has emerged, in which Arab nationalism plays out, in which Arab undemocracy and dictatorship functions, has he continued to push this line without acknowledging the complexity.
Yeah, I think that article actually is a fantastic one in Fathom. People should definitely look that up. I think it's by Joshua Brooks. Okay, I think we have room for one final question, and then we're going to call it a day and say good night and good day, and thank Gil. So Pearl says that she's found that saying that Israel is the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, that they are indigenous to the area, is effective when talking to anti-Israel advocates. So that's her statement. So I'm going to ask you, A, whether you agree with that, and B, to sort of broaden it out and what do you find is the most effective way of arguing the case for Zionism, and perhaps not with the un-Jews or the people that are really have their hearts set on bashing Israel and bashing Zionism, but people that really don't know very much, but simply have their sense in their head that Zionism is a bad idea.
Well, thank you. That first of all, I echo that, and Erwin Kotler, my hero, my mentor, the former Canadian Justice Minister and great human rights activist, says, "You want an original Aboriginal people? The Jews are the original Aboriginal people. We are truly the indigenous people, reading from the same Bible, speaking the same language, rooted in the same homeland. What's more indigenous than that? What's more Aboriginal than that?" And by the way, when he was Justice Minister and he sat with representatives from the Aboriginal peoples and he validated their experience, they had an amazing, profound connection, because he wasn't talking at them, he was talking to them. And I don't have time, because I want to respect the time, to go into how I approach it, but one of the things is tonal. I'm, as you can hear, very angry at the un-Jews. When I sit on campus, when I was at the University of Nottingham in England, and facing 150 students, very few of whom were Jewish, and it was campus security, and everybody was sure there was going to be an explosion. And I started with a very calm tone, and I talked about nationalism as a neutral tool. Nationalism that destroyed the Jewish people when it was Nazism, and that elevated the Jewish people when it was Zionism. When I talked about a complex narrative, when I talked about, as a nationalist, being able to understand Palestinian aspirations, but as long as those aspirations aren't turned against me, but are about building themselves up, I'm fine with it. And when I talked about identity Zionism and our quest for meaning and our quest for homeland and our quest for roots, the conversation changed. But one woman nevertheless raised a hand and she said, "Well, But why is it that in the recent Gaza conflict, this is back in closer to 2009, only 14 Israelis were killed and hundreds of Palestinians were killed? And I said, do you really want me to get up here and apologize for the fact that the Israel Defense Forces with a D defends the Jewish people, especially after all we've suffered? Do you really want me to apologize for the fact that we build bomb shelters all along the Gaza border, which we withdrew from in the hope for peace, and that they take their concrete and use it to build tunnels to try to kidnap us? Do you really want me to apologize? And went on and on, and I got standing ovation. So there is a way of speaking to people, listening to their concerns, respecting them. And, you know, we learned from the Bible, there's a time for this and there's a time for that. There was a time for Natan and I to write Never Alone and call for dialogue, and we still truly believe in dialogue. But there was a time after this conflict, when so many of this small group were turning against us in such a vicious way for us to say, Ad Kan, enough. You've left the tent. You are on Jews. You were trying to disentangle modern Judaism from Jewish peoplehood, from Jewish statehood. And that has genocidal implications and will not pass. And so I thank you, Paul, for giving me this opportunity to talk it through. I apologize again for the sound and light show here, but it's a very special, wonderful day as we saw a president from the right, Ruby Rivlin, pass on the torch to a president from the left, Isaac Herzog, because both of them are presidents of the blue and white from the center and from the Jewish people. And that's really the emphasis. And so I want to wish everybody a Laila Tov and good luck in us all finding a way forward where we don't agree on everything, but we understand that we have to agree on core fundamentals and then fight it out, but fight it out with respect and love and accuracy and thought, and read my articles before you attack them. Thank you.
Yeah, everyone should read the article if they haven't already. It's in Tablet Magazine. I sent it out in my email, so definitely read it. Gil, thank you so much. The light behind you is kind of giving a sort of halo. So it's I think it's actually giving this sort of nice. It's lending a sort of some kind of sacred effect to your teaching, to your Torah. Gil, as always,
it's the message, not the man.
Okay, so you, as always, the humility comes with the insight and the great education and advocacy that we expect from you, and it's been a pleasure as always, Gil. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And as I said, email me if you want to be on the mailing list, paulg@begincenter.org.il. Information about our English events will also be on our Facebook page and our website. I wish everyone a good day, good evening, depending where you are in the world, and farewell. Bye.
Thank you.